Hello, everyone, and welcome to KITE Research Rounds. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Suan Sisto. Dr. Sisto is a professor and chair of the Department of Rehabilitation Science at the University at Buffalo. She's currently the director of the Biomechanics Lab, where her research involves the recovery of function after spinal cord injury, after locomotor and neuromodulation interventions. Dr. Sisto has previously designed and built two other similar labs at Keesler Institute in New Jersey and at Stony Brook University. Additionally, she has focused on recovery of walking and health outcomes after spinal cord injury. She has received several SCI grants examining wheelchair propulsion biomechanics, locomotor training effects on respiratory, autonomic, and cardiovascular outcomes. Notably, in 2012, she became the first physical therapist to become a fellow of the ACRM, the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine, and she served as the president of the ACRM from 2013 to 2015. Just a logistic notes, you can type in your questions in Slido and Dr. Sisto will answer them at the end of the talk. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sisto.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tati, for that very nice introduction and welcome. I guess I should say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the time zone that you're in. I'm very happy to speak to you today on spinal cord injury neuromodulation. My work is supported by a New York State Department of Health Spinal Cord Injury Research Board grant, which I'd just like to recognize in my work. So the objectives today will be to review differences in spinal cord injury gait versus using compensation versus activity-based therapy approaches. And the reason why I wanted to start that way is to start from a macro level point of view so that we could begin to look more at a micro level point of view as we move further through the talk. So I'll begin to, after that, review some animal and human evidence to activity-based therapies in spinal cord injury. I'm going to provide some background on magnetic stimulation technologies, and then discuss approaches to achieving spinal stimulation. I'll present some preliminary work. We just had a paper come out just last month from spinal stimulation in rodents and human spinal cord injury participants. So first, I'd like to start out with a learning module that we did over 10 years ago, which is very applicable today in terms of what happens in the human individual with spinal cord injury. We presented this with several authors, including Andrea Behrman, who's very famous in terms of understanding locomotor training, Doctors Hutchinson, myself, Watson, Ardolino, and Basso, presented this work where we looked at the paths of achieving functional goals. And when we traditionally, I understand the audience is a mix of clinicians and engineering, so I'm going to try to address some concepts that maybe resonate a little bit more with clinicians or engineering, people with engineering background. So when we think of compensation, it's the way I was trained initially as a physical therapist years ago, that if a person had paralysis, we were to just compensate for that deficit, put on a brace, put in a wheelchair, and pretty much the only thing that we worked on was the remaining musculature above the level of the lesion. When we think about recovery, we want to recover the neuromuscular system to achieve a functional goal. And that's a little bit different than compensation, where you're using these alternative strategies or technologies to compensate for these deficits. So if you look at this individual right here, if you just watch him walking, you might notice a few things. You might notice that he's putting a great deal of his weight on his arms. So we do know that when we put weight on our arms, we turn off EMG activity in the legs. So he was taught this way by physical therapists. And this is the way, again, we were trained years ago to teach recovery of walking. Notice that he has a brace here on his leg. And notice that he's hiking his hip so that he can clear this leg. So this essentially is a form of compensation in the sense that you're providing a brace, you're providing a walker, and the person is leaning forward to walk. Interestingly, this man, if you tried to stand him up straight, he would say, "No, no, 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 don't do that, don't do that. I'm going to fall, I'm going to fall." And eventually, what happens, which I won't show you exactly until you see the video, but eventually, just getting him close to a wall and getting him to feel that he can stand up straight, sort of began to reverse this walking pattern. So that's compensation. Now, recovery, we want to restore the neuromuscular system in order to regain a functional task. So now look at this same man. He's now on a treadmill. And do you notice any difference? You should notice a few things. One, he's walking very fast, much faster than he was with a walker. They're starting to throw little things on the treadmill to really challenge him, to make sure that he can adapt in this kind of environment. So my goal here is to really show you the difference between compensation and recovery. Now the individual is upright, there's less hip hiking, and he's also showing some adaptability where he's not falling. He's a principal in a school, in a middle school, and kids are running all over the place, potentially knocking him down. So his goal was to be able to walk without falling. And so this body weight support system really has no support right now. He's weight bearing entirely on his legs. And this is essentially what we think of now as recovery below the level of the injury. So this is referred to, this locomotor training strategy, as an activity-based therapy, meaning we take advantage of activity-dependent plasticity where we practice intensely with intense repetition. And the great part about the treadmill is that you get much more repetition on a treadmill than you do over ground. Not to say that you wouldn't practice the same things over ground that you learned on the treadmill. But these activity-based therapies take advantage of the intrinsic neurobiology in the control of walking that is within the spinal cord itself. So when we think about walking, we don't think about walking. It takes place in the spinal networks. It's only when we have to step over something or walk on a sheet of ice where we start to cognitively take advantage of that a supraspinal center to control walking. But typically walking is a very fundamental, basic spinal reflex. And the activity of the neuromuscular system, as I mentioned, we are trying to activate things now below the spinal cord injury, the level. So the expectation is recovery of those functions and activities below that lesion to restore a functional task like standing or walking. So here's another example of an individual who, sorry about the volume. So this individual, I just wanted to turn down the volume a little bit, this is a different individual with a spinal cord injury. And now we have a person on one leg, a person on the other leg, and a person controlling the pelvis. But the beauty of this kind of intervention is that because you're providing manual assistance, as soon as the patient is able to do it themselves, they actually you can withdraw your support. In fact, that's one of the principles of locomotor training, is to withdraw your support when the person is able to do it themselves. And that's what happens with recovery. So you're taking advantage of this intrinsic neurobiology in the spinal cord, because the treadmill is creating this rhythmicity of hip extension, hip flexion, and the same at the knee and the ankle. So we think originally, or we thought originally, that one paradigm of voluntary control was we would have this spinal cord injury, and this is the damage that's occurred. And rarely do we see this kind of transection, but yes, there's a significant amount of damage in the spinal cord itself, and there's a very severe contusion. And it was originally thought of as hierarchical. In other words, the spinal cord could not repair itself. So we would teach new behavioral skills that were compensation based, because we thought, well, if the spinal cord was damaged, it couldn't recover. And what we really know now is there's very few fibers that are really needed for walking. And if there's any way to reconnect or sprout around an area of injury, depending, it could be a variety of mechanisms, which is why we're seeing improvements resulting from locomotor training. So the translation of science discovery to clinical really needed to, the basic scientist needed to speak to the clinical scientist. And that really didn't happen initially. But once that happened, we took leaps and bounds. So I'm going to show you this video, which I've had permission to use from Dr. Reggie Edgerton at UCLA, of a spinalized cat. So I realize the screen is black, but I want you to just understand this cat has had a spinal cord injury where the two ends of the spinal cord were separated, literally with material to make sure there was no communication in the spinal cord. And what happened here is that initially the cat started to demonstrate a stepping pattern. There's a little bit of support here with the tail, but once the support was provided, there was some steps happening. And this later on was the precursor to locomotor training. So here the cat is actually, the investigator is actually providing a little bit of assistance and less support with the tail, because the cat is able to weight bear on the limbs without collapsing. So you can see that the person is barely supporting the cat with the tail. And so what's really interesting here is you'll see the speed of the treadmill increase, and the hind limbs will actually go faster and faster and faster without any supraspinal control. And this is how we began to realize through Dr. Reggie Edgerton's work that we had a communication with basic scientists and clinical scientists that helped us to say, wait a minute, if this happens in an animal, there are spinal cord injured individuals that have far less severe injuries than that. We should be able to promote recovery. So really, does the basic science support these observations? There are many observations in the literature that address the importance of loading. So remember I said the individual with a walker wasn't really loading their legs, they were loading their arms on the walker. And so loading is very important. Speed is very important. We need to work on getting the individual walking on a treadmill at a fairly rapid speed while still heavily loading. And this all happens very gradually. And then we need to have normal kinematics. If we train that individual with a walker to lean forward, they're going to walk leaning forward. So we want upright kinematics and all normal kinematics, as we saw in those earlier videos that I mentioned. Task specificity, most people have heard this before. If we train an individual to stand, they will stand, but they will not walk. If we train an individual to walk, They will walk, but they won't stand. So task specificity in the walking practice is extremely important. And then learning from sensory input where the particular hand contacts on the tendons that promote flexion of the knee and hip and flexion, dorsal and plantar flexion of the ankle have to do with the sensory input of the hand placements on the limbs of the individual. And finally, interlimb coordination, how those the timing of the two limbs is important. In particular, making sure the hip goes into extension to once it's offloaded to then facilitate the next flexion phase or the swing phase of gait. So what are the critical elements? As I mentioned, intense practice is a critical element of locomotor training in spinal cord in animal models. And task specificity, you saw the changes in the speed and the normal kinematics with activity dependent learning. So the spinal cord is learning, the spinal cord is smart. So we now have this new model. Instead of it being hierarchical, where the spinal cord cannot repair itself, and we just teach behavioral skills or compensatory skills, we have this new model or this new thought process, which is hierarchical. The system is plastic, and we can sort of see this as locomotor activity begins. We take advantage of the spinal cord central pattern generator, where this automaticity, if you will, is facilitated by treadmill walking. And so activity-based therapy really aims to restore that function to its premorbid level as much as is feasibly possible. I will not talk about all these studies, just to point to you, there are many human studies that were a spin-off of Dr. Reggie Edgerton's animal work and others, where we were able to show many benefits from locomotor training in human trials. So some of the key observations I want to review with you is that when we are walking, we're stepping, but we also must have dynamic balance. So we have to have the ability to adapt to the environment. And that's why at the higher level stages, you saw the ball being thrown on a treadmill to see if their locomotor system could adapt. This is giving great input to the spinal cord while walking on a treadmill. So the principles, we want to maximize weight bearing on the legs, optimize sensory cues on the limbs, provide normal kinematics consistent with each task, and maximize recovery, minimize compensation. So less weight bearing on the arms to no weight bearing on the arms, and as much as possible on the legs. Again, intense practice, lots of repetition, but the idea of progression is by increasing the speed of the treadmill, increasing the load, so that's decreasing the body weight support, and decreasing the assistance, the physical assistance that the trainers are providing. That is task specific, then taking those skills. So you think of the treadmill as kind of priming the spinal cord, and then taking those that spinal cord, if you will, from the treadmill training onto overground walking and practicing those skills, whether it be trunk balance or sit to stand or walking, practicing those overground, because now the spinal cord is sort of woken up and saying, hey, let's try this. So that's really important too. And then, of course, practicing in the home environment to give some extra work. So this led us to probably 10 to 15 years of work in the Neuro Recovery Center, where there were several centers across the United States that collected data in clinical centers in these centers that were billable services, but we were able to capture data on specific outcome measures after approximately 60 sessions. of locomotor training. And to date, we probably have 600 to 800 cases of individuals in this database. And for your information, if you would like to learn more about locomotor training, we published this entire supplement in the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation in 2012, which defines in great detail what locomotor training is and how locomotor training affected a variety of things: cardiovascular outcomes, autonomic outcomes, walking outcomes, balance outcomes. It's all in this issue. So please make yourself available to look at this if you're interested. In addition, there's another scale that we've decided to use, which is called the Neuromuscular Recovery Scale. And that is because we realized that the Asia impairment scale was not sensitive at all. In fact, we're trying to work on a paper right now which identifies the fact that people who have an AISC scale or D score or D, you can progress and never change your Asia score. So this neuromuscular recovery scale is also published in the archives in the same issue, and it's really important to read about this because it is sensitive to change, functional change from a sitting, sit to stand, and walking goal, which is not the case with the Asia exam. So we make clinical decisions on whether the person has upper motor neuron or lower motor neuron injury. Typically, the upper motor neuron injuries are the ones that are going to recover the most because they have the spinal circuitry and less peripheral nerve injury. What precautions should one consider? Did they have a prior history of fractures? Do they have autonomic dysreflexia? And then what is the intensity and duration and frequency of this intervention? So there's a whole textbook on how to begin this intervention and how to progress it in terms of these intensity, duration, and frequency parameters. And should we start early on or should we wait a while? So typically we start as early as we can, as soon as they're finished their rehabilitation. But we've had people as chronic as 20 to 30 years post-injury. And then how do we demonstrate benefit with outcome measures? So we'll talk about a decision tree that's based on a literature review. So if you're answering yes to include this patient, great. If not, what are some of the other options that could be available to a patient? Are there other robotic options or exoskeleton options? But if the patient progresses, what are some of the next steps that you would do after locomotor training? And then if they don't progress, what are some other options? So these are things that therapists will think about pretty routinely. And I'm happy to talk about this, but I wanted to take a moment to show you some of these videos of this individual. And the three environments are treadmill, overground, and I'll say this is overground, but the third environment is home and community. So let me show you this video first. Oh, maybe that one's not working. Let me try this one. Okay, so here we have an individual who's standing with a walker, and you can see the therapists are holding her knees because her knees will collapse and holding very tightly around the pelvis. And they're trying just to see if she could stand. But you see, they're beginning to see if she could take a step, but we see that she's also weight bearing on her arms, and that's maybe all that they could do at this point. If you take a look at the video below, now they've taken away the walker and they're just trying to see if the individual could shift her weight and advance a leg. So she has an arm on each shoulder of the therapist, but they're also trying to help advance their legs. I'm sorry this video isn't working, but you were able to see at least that that video earlier of the person walking on the treadmill. So the types of things that we would consider looking at have to do with the International Classification of Functions scale, some body structure and functions, some activities, and some participation measures. Do they have muscle strength, or do they have spasticity? What is their Berg balance score, and do they have any sensation? Bed mobility, transfers, standing, how do they propel their wheelchair? If they use a wheelchair, how do they walk with a rolling walker? And then do they participate in daily life? This woman was unable to care for her 4-year-old daughter and then was unable to return to work at a nursery school. And she had a fairly high level of depression. So she had a motor incomplete AIS classification with some leg movement, some spasticity, a strong family support, and available transportation. She was motivated to recover, and she happened to have the benefit of having primary and secondary insurance. So now take a look at her coming to standing now. So it's not quite there yet. She's struggling, but she's trying to stand up, and the therapist is giving her a little bit of a chance to try it. So the only way that she's able to stand up here is to push off the chair. And that, in a sense, is compensation, right? So she's not exactly coming up and standing the way you or I would stand up. Those are still limitations that she had. But the next few sessions on the treadmill will focus on trying to get more hip extensions so that she could stand on her own. Now take a look at her. Okay, so now she's able to stand. She's comfortable standing in such a way that she's able to adjust her shirt. She's able to, you'll see her kind of brush her hair out of the way. So that tells you a good deal about her ability to balance. And then the therapist is going to proceed to go along and do a Berg balance test. So I'm not going to show you that whole test. But essentially, you should be able to see pretty significant improvement in this individual. Does everybody improve this much? No, but there is a great potential in the spinal cord to recover when practicing on the treadmill and over ground. Some other locomotor devices that are available that are less expensive on the market, I have pictures of here in terms of the Biodex and the Lightgate. They're a little more challenging to position yourself to assist the patient, but you also have the benefit of having this device roll off the treadmill and have the person walk over ground while still having body weight support. So that's nice. And then we also see a pediatric versions of these devices. And Dr. Behrman is an expert in treating pediatric spinal cord injury. So these are devices that could be made available, but she's designed her own for the little ones. And then we have a Locomat, which is a locomotor training robot. And this is kind of interesting. And sometimes people will argue in the earliest stages of recovery, this is really a great option because it doesn't require any manual assistance or labor for any individual helping the person. The problem is that the person kind of zones out and just lets the robot move instead of trying to activate their own muscles below the level of the injury. And people have told me this time and again, as much as you can change the settings on the Locomat, it's a little bit different than when we put our hands on the patient and we can kind of withdraw them as needed even within a session or within a step. So we have I wrote a book on spinal cord injury in 2009 and rehabilitation. And at the time I didn't really emphasize enough of the activity-based kinds of therapy. There are great chapters in this book, but some of them focus on compensation and some of them focus on recovery. So I'll leave that up to you to decide what you think. Okay, so now I'm moving into the area, I'm changing gears and I'm moving into the area of magnetic stimulation. And now magnetic stimulation is typically applied over the cortex, where you can see on the top left picture. However, with the study that we're doing, we are actually providing stimulation over the spine itself to stimulate the spinal cord. And so we know that there are human and animal studies that have provided promising insights into electromagnetic stimulation that result in longer term changes in synaptic strength and synaptic remodeling at the brain and the spinal cord. The challenges are that there's a great deal of inter-individual variability, and to get enough sample sizes is a real challenge for us. So doing some neuroimaging, guided electromagnetic stimulation would be one way to go, and using physiological testing to ensure that the effect of the electromagnetic stimulation is having an effect on the spinal circuitry is also important. So just briefly, the technology related to electromagnetic induction involves the stimulation coil induction, which starts out with an electrical current circulating in the stimulation coil that produces a magnetic field. And the changing magnetic field produces a flow of electrical current in the nearby tissue. And these are often referred to as primary currents, as you would see, for example, in loop 1, and a secondary current or an eddy current in the opposite direction, as you see in loop 2. So the other thing that's important to think about when you're thinking about magnetic stimulation, some units are monophasic and some units provide a biphasic uh, current. So why is this important? At different levels of delivery of chart, when you have a monophasic versus a biphasic, there are different levels of delivery of charge that this affects. And this can affect the intensity delivered into the cellular tissue. So if you have a long, slower decline and there's more area under the curve, we would probably have a greater shot at introducing more current into the tissue than if we had a rapid decline and a rapid rise. And then we also have to think about the positive versus the negative ion effect on tissues in a biphasic current. So the coil, just note that the coil produces voltage that is out of phase with the voltage delivery because of the recharging that is needed when the voltage is at its maximum, and these shaded areas here, all the energy is in the coil, but when it's at the minimum, here at baseline, all the energy goes back into the machine, which is the capacitor, and recharges. So there's that out of phase factor. Monophasic waveforms, as I mentioned to you, allow the current to dissipate more slowly before recharging, and an induced magnetic field depends on the rate of change of this current. So we may have a stronger rate of change here, or it may be similar to the monophasic, but a rapid decline, which is not as rapid with the monophasic. So you just have to be aware of the differences. And if you're comparing the literature, you need to be sure you know whether they're using mono or biphasic. So I know we're talking about spinal stimulation, and this is cortical stimulation, but I just want to illustrate to you one factor. If you look in the blue panel here, and we have the spinal cord here, and we produce, let's say, stimulation instead of over the brain, over the spinal cord, we're going to get a stimulation that goes to the muscle that creates this motor evoked potential, or MEP. So I just want you to keep that in your mind as we start to go forward and look at the electrophysiology changes that we found. So the figure of 8 coil has this this is the coil that we're using on the spine. And it has a direction of the current going counterclockwise and clockwise, which in the center of this coil produces the strongest current into, in this example, the brain. There are several stimulation devices, and I'll just briefly go over 3 that provide magnetic stimulation on the market. I have no financial association with any of these companies, but I just wanted to let you know there are 3 major ones that are available, and they're slightly different. It's the MagStim by Jolly Medical, MagPro by MagVenture, and PowerMag by Mag and More. And this is what the systems look like. So the MagStim, this is a monophasic system, and this is a biphasic system. And the nice part about this system is that you could stimulate you could use paired stimulation, so stimulate the spinal cord and a peripheral muscle at the same time. And the Rapid 2 is a very high intensity stimulation. And by the way, this has been quite challenging to get through the IRB for them in terms of risk factors when it comes to cortical stimulation. Here's an example of several types of coils that are on the market for this MagStim company. And I'm only pointing this out to you so you can see the variety. This particular coil is used over the cortex, and it's called the cone coil because in order to get to the deep portion of the cortex that represents the leg, we need this conical formed coil. This is a D70 square coil, and this is the one that we use for our studies because it has the greatest depth of penetration. I will note to you that some of the challenges with the coils are the coils will heat up with higher intensity stimulation. So the MagPro system actually has a coil that has a cooling feature, which is pretty neat. We actually do not use this coil, and so we have 2 coils. So when our coil heats up, we just change it to the same coil and cool down the previous coil. But there are a variety of coils. Here's one for a rat, but these cooling features are quite nice, and these are of different shapes. And finally, the Mag and More. And the main feature about the Mag and More is that you can actually stimulate the brain while recording EEG to determine what portions of the brain are being activated by the TMS centrally as well as peripherally when you're looking at the motor evoked potential, let's say in an arm or hand muscle. And these are the coils that are available from the Mag and More. Again, a variety of shapes and sizes, and the selection is important for you to think about. So here's where we need our engineers to help us. This is a heat map for a circular coil or a figure of 8 coil. And remember I said that the intensity is for the figure of 8 coil is in the center where the 2 circles of the figure 8 hover. And that's really where we place over the spine this region right here. So this is basically this kind of voltage per meter map here. And this is really helpful to me. It verifies to me that this is really the intensity hotspot. But what I really want to know is what is the depth of penetration? Are we stimulating the spinal cord, or are we stimulating the peripheral nerves coming out of the spinal cord? So next I'll talk about spinal stimulation translation from the animal models to the human. And I wanted to first point out this paper that we published in 2015, where it really launched us into a human trial with magnetic stimulation. So if you look at this graph here, I'd like you to just focus on this very green color here. So each of the bars represent the rat having a laminectomy only, so nothing else, and a control group which is the gray color, the magnetic stimulation only, which is the red or orange color, and exercise only, which is the yellow color. But the most important, as I said, to focus on would be the combination of electrical stim, magnetic stim rather, and exercise together, which was a swimming exercise for the rodent. And we can see not too much changes are happening for the first 3 weeks, but week 4, 5, and all the way up to week 9, we saw significant improvements in the group that had magnetic stimulation and exercise in the ladder test. So how often does the paw slip through the ladder? In the balance beam test. And this is called the catwalk. I don't know why, because it's a rodent, but it essentially measures the paw prints as a rat is walking across a translucent platform. And we can see a variety of things. One is the regularity index, and we want that to be high. We want the reciprocal nature of the rat walking to be regular. And you can see this green color demonstrates the combination of magnetic stimulation and exercise to be showing the greatest change at week 5 and week 4. In terms of the base of support, as the rodent is recovering, we should expect these two hind limbs to come closer together to have a base of support underneath the legs themselves. And so that's called a base of support. We want that to be smaller. And you can see here in the green line, this does improve more significantly for the combination group of magnetic stimulation and exercise. So this will lead us to a study that we're doing now. But before we get there, I was very concerned about the condition that people with spinal cord injury have, where they have metal rods or really titanium rods placed in their spine to stabilize the spine after a fracture. So if we were to put a magnetic stimulation coil over the spine, would we activate something that would be deleterious to the patient? I really didn't think so, because since late 1970s, titanium rods have been used so that they could be MRI specific, but I really still wanted to test it to be sure. So what we did here first, we have the figure of 8 coil, and we used a titanium rod that was given to us by a neurosurgeon just to see if when we turned on the coil stimulation, whether this coil moved in any way or heated up in any way, which it did not. And then we implanted the titanium rod into the rat, and we stimulated it with the coil. These two circles represent the coil. And we wanted to see if in vivo, if the tissue heated up or whether the rod vibrated or moved in any way, which it did not. And here we see basically at 70% stimulation intensity of the magnetic stimulation, we found no difference with the titanium rod there versus without the titanium rod. As well as when we did a motor evoked potential recruitment map, you can't even tell with the rods present or the rods not present. These lines are superimposed right on top of each other in terms of increasing stimulation intensity all the way up to 100%. So I was pretty confident that this would be safe. So we began to embark on looking at the study of the modulation of H-reflexes as well as frequency-dependent depression in using spinal electromagnetic stimulation, which I'll call SEMS, in rats and humans. So just as a reminder, when we do a stimulation, we try to stimulate over the spinal cord. We may be stimulating some of the nerves that exit the spinal cord, but essentially this reflex loop here, when it's intact, has a normal H reflex. And this M wave, first of all, this is a stimulation artifact from the stimulation to the nerve or to the spinal cord. The next bump you see here is the M wave, which is the contraction of the muscle. And the third wave that you see here is the H reflex, and that's this negative, positive, negative wave form here. And that's indicative of the entire loop, which is why it becomes late. It's later in this plot here over time. And that is the amplitude of that we know is a certain magnitude in normal, with normal circuitry. And we know that that is different in spinal cord injury. So Gerasimenko did a very elegant study by putting an electromagnetic coil over the thoracic spine, and it produced sort of a locomotor-like leg movement in these healthy individuals. So that really prompted more of the human studies. But to just tell you an additional part of this study, we looked at some rats again and did some stimulation on the tibial nerve as well as directly on the nerve. So the nerve behind the knee as well as directly on the nerve. And we found a modulation of the M wave and the H reflex to be increased with magnetic stimulation. So then we also began to look at in the human individual, when we put the coil over the SEMS, so spinal electromagnetic stimulation, over the spinal cord, and we have a stimulating electrode here to determine if we stimulate here and record on the soleus muscle, we should be able to record that loop going back to the spinal cord in a healthy participant versus people with chronic spinal cord injury. And we can see here that in a healthy individual, we see an increase after administering spinal electromagnetic stimulation. Even for one session, we see an increase in this H wave. In spinal cord injured participants, we see a significant increase in this wave. And we also noticed that that happened, lasted about an hour, which I didn't show here. So essentially, we're just saying that what I just pointed out here is that H reflex increases from before to after SEMS in the control, as well as the stimulation threshold decreases, meaning I need less stimulation to get the same response after SEMS. That happens in healthy individuals. In spinal cord injured individuals, we see a similar increase in this spinal cord injury post-SEMS response in the amplitude of the H reflex, and we see a decrease as well as in the motor threshold. So this is leading us to think that we are promoting with magnetic stimulation a pattern, an electrophysiological pattern that is similar to the healthy individuals. So we have embarked on a large-scale study. I am the PI of this study, where we are looking in the third year of the study, translating the animals from the results from our animal experiments into human, and looking at the neuroplasticity from SEMS and hopefully translating it into clinical practice. So we use the SEM-induced H reflex response to peripheral nerve stimulation on the tibial nerve, TNS, and we hypothesized that it would be different between spinal cord injury and healthy on the leg with the neurophysiological responses. This is an example of the setup where we provide magnetic stimulation on the lumbar region, in this case, lower thoracic. And we provide we have wireless EMG electrodes here. And this is our stimulating electrode here for the tibial nerve stimulation. And so this is the general setup for human. And what we're finding, again, is something also very unique called frequency-dependent depression, or FDD. And what we're finding here is in something different between the non-injured and the spinal cord. That if you do a recruitment, if you start changing the frequency over time, the H reflex starts to diminish as the frequency increases. And this happens both pre and post SEMS. It stays about the same in individuals with who are healthy. However, in chronic spinal cord injury, we noticed a very big difference. So if we look at the healthy individual person here in the solid black line, and we compare that to a person with chronic spinal cord injury, we see a shift to the left. Oh, I'm sorry. So the solid line is pre, and the dotted line is post SEMS. And so we see that there's this depression of the curve and a shifting of the curve to the left as stimulation intensity increases. So we hear this was very interesting to us, and we've actually corroborated this finding with 3 sessions of SEMS, as well as we're now almost finished with 5 weeks of SEMS. So those results are pending. So just to close, we should consider several things when we look at these protocols. We should be looking at whether the movement that we're considering is monosynaptic in terms of the 1A excitation, whether there's some homeostatic depression. This was reported by Nuku in the Journal of Neuroscience Methods. It's an excellent review of what to consider when adopting these protocols. There may be some presynaptic inhibition of the 1A afferents, or there may be reciprocal inhibition or non-reciprocal inhibition or recurrent inhibition. So we have to really understand those mechanisms. And we have to look at the effect of spasticity on these factors. Sometimes when we create stimulation with the peripheral nerve, we actually induce clonus or spasticity in that calf muscle in spinal cord injury. So could there be some postsynaptic inhibition that results after the triggering of this, this reflex response? We should also think about postsynaptic inhibition that may be differently organized in the cervical spine versus the lumbar spine. And then what happens in terms of the spinal reflex excitability and the interneural circuits? Are the, how do we really understand those and how important those interneurons are besides the main circuits? And then how do we incorporate conditioning protocols, for example, to up or down regulate the H reflex, which could produce greater plastic changes in exercise? So in the future, we should think about more translational neuroscience studies in the area of the cortical control of walking after SCI. Maybe after spinal cord injury, there's some reorganization of the cortex. And maybe if we can determine if supraspinal circuits modulate recovery, we should probably monitor what cortical changes have occurred in the person with spinal cord injury, in addition to the spinal circuits. And then what happens to as a result of locomotor training on spinal circuits? That's what we're studying right now. So we're combining magnetic stimulation with locomotor training to see if magnetic stimulation becomes the primer and locomotor training then becomes more effective in recovery of the spinal circuits. What happens with paired stimulation? If we stimulate the spinal cord and a peripheral muscle, what happens if do we prime the spinal circuitry even better? And what other regions of stimulation, such as the cerebellum or the brainstem or other cortical regions that could promote neuroplasticity of the CNS circuits or prime them to couple with other rehabilitation interventions. And with that, I'll end to thank my colleagues both at Stony Brook University and University at Buffalo who have helped me to complete all of this research. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. At this point, we invite the audience to type in your questions in Slido. Just give us a second getting set up here.
Sure.
All right, so we have our first question on Slido. So you mentioned that some people recover more than others. Do we know what factors determine that?
Yes, some factors include severity of injury, duration of injury. So we know that the more chronic an individual is, the slower that trajectory is on recovery, but you can get to the same place. So it's just a matter of more sessions and more patience. So duration of injury, severity of injury, and also sometimes age will have a factor, that people have other cardiovascular diseases and other respiratory diseases that are limiting their capacity on a treadmill. But I would say primarily duration and severity of injury will affect the outcomes differently. I hope that answers that question.
Can I jump in with a quick question? Do you think there might be a role in using a vision-based system to monitor movements and monitor just body pose and also limb movements?
It's interesting a question. We don't know if the visual system is too slow to enable the person to process their visual image of themselves, to render a change in their behavior fast enough. And so we are walking on a treadmill at once we get up to the stage, we are walking at about 2 miles an hour, let's say. And so I'm not sure, but you can tell me if you think that the visual system can process that information fast enough for the individual to make those changes. Typically, the sensory system, that is either a stretch system from the hand contact on the tendon, or the proprioceptive system, the foot on the ground, the movement of the treadmill, and that speed are faster than the visual system. But I'm love to chat.
I'm not sure. It might not be fast enough. The sensing side on the technology side is definitely fast enough, but on the person side, it might not be fast enough. But I'm really interested in chatting with you afterwards later to follow up to see if there's opportunities. There might be opportunities.
Yes, I'd love to talk. Thank you for that question.
Janitha, are there more questions? It's 1 o'clock, so I know quite a few people had another meeting afterwards that wanted to attend. So Janitha, I don't know if you agree, we might be it might be a good time to close this, finish this presentation. And if people have other questions, maybe they can reach out to Dr. Sisto, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, we just received one question. I don't know if you want to go through this last question and then we can
Yeah,
close
sure.
off
Go
the
ahead
meeting.
with this last one as well.
So the final question is, how long do you think it will take for this therapy to be available for patients?
I think very soon, because we've determined that it's safe. We just want to show that it's effective. And the results of the study for magnetic stimulation alone are showing very promising effects. Patients are reporting changes in sensation after 3 sessions, which really surprised us. But we don't really know for sure if it's something that is going to be meaningful for the person functionally. So that's why we're doing a host of outcome measures, functional outcome measures, in combination with locomotor training to see if we can make changes in their meaningful function. So I have another year left on this study, and once published, I'm hoping to begin to put it into clinical practice for everyone. I like that question.
Maybe you can give us another talk in a year's time.
Yes, I will. I'd love to be invited back. Thank you so much.
That would be great. Thank you. Okay, let's conclude the session, and please join me in thanking our speaker, Dr. Sisto. It's really hard to do clapping over online, especially because the audience is in a different room. But thank you so much on behalf of the Institute, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure others did as well.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, we're good.